Okay, let's dive in. Today we're tackling something, well, fundamental, but actually incredibly complex. It's these hidden forces that dictate how we can use and shape the land around us. You might look at a piece of property and think about what you want to do with it, but uh, that decision is never really made in a vacuum, is it? It's guided by this intricate kind of multi-layered system of rules and regulations.
It really is. It's like an unseen blueprint or maybe an invisible hand guiding things from, the smallest backyard project to the largest developments. Every decision, every transaction is shaped by these controls. They determine pretty much everything. Can you build a garage? How tall can a skyscraper be? What kind of business can open up shop there?
Right. And our mission in this deep dive is to take your stack of sources, all these articles, research notes you've shared, and sort of unpack that blueprint. We want to cut through the complexity and really pull out the crucial insights you need.
Absolutely. Especially for you navigating the California real estate world. I mean, this stuff isn't just about passing an exam. It's completely essential for, confidently advising your clients. It's about spotting potential problems before they become big, costly issues. It's understanding the real opportunities, the limitations of a property, and guiding people thoughtfully. Being restorative, as you put it, really means helping clients make informed choices in this landscape defined by these rules.
Okay, so if we're building this blueprint, where do we start? What's the foundation?
That would have to be local zoning. Yeah, it's the most immediate kind of granular control.
Zoning. Okay, explain it simply. What's zoning actually doing?
Well, think of it like the local government dividing up the city or county into different zones, right? And then they assign specific rules to each zone. These rules dictate what you can build: houses, shops, industry, and also how you can build it. How tall, how much of the lot can it cover, how far back from the street, the neighbors. It's all about managing land use to kind of achieve a planned community character.
So if I'm in a single-family residential zone, zoning is what stops someone putting, like, a noisy garage next door.
Exactly that. It separates incompatible uses. It helps ensure development happens in a reasonably orderly way. It directly impacts what you can and can't do with any given property.
But things aren't always completely rigid, are they? Are there ways to get some uh, flexibility within those rules?
There can be, yes. The two main ways you might get some wiggle room are variances and conditional use permits.
Okay, variances. I hear that term quite a bit. What situation would call for a variance?
A variance is basically permission to deviate from a specific zoning rule, but only because there's something unique about your property, something that makes it exceptionally difficult, maybe even impossible to follow the standard rule. The key thing, and the sources really stress this, is unique hardship. It's not granted just because you want to do something different. It's because the property itself has a peculiar situation, maybe an odd shape, weird topography, existing constraints that other properties nearby don't have.
Ah, okay.
Okay.
So it's tied to the property itself, not just what the owner wants.
Precisely. You have to demonstrate that sticking to the strict rule would create an unreasonable hardship specific to that parcel. And you also have to show that granting the variance won't mess up the overall zoning plan for the neighborhood too much. The sources make it clear these are looked at really closely.
Are all variances the same type of thing?
No, there are different kinds. A dimensional variance might let you build a bit closer to a property line than the rules usually allow, maybe because the lot's shape makes the standard setback impossible. But a use variance, it's a much bigger deal. That's asking permission to use the property in a way that's not allowed at all in that zone. Like putting a shop in a residential zone, or maybe multi-unit housing where only single-family homes are supposed to be.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds like it really changes things.
It absolutely does, which is why use variances are incredibly hard to get. You usually have to show a real hardship that prevents any sort of reasonable economic return using the permitted uses. Like one source says, they aren't granted lightly. They often need extra findings from the planning board or whoever approves it, justifying why it's okay while still trying to uphold the regulations.
Okay, so variance equals unique hardship. What about the other one? Conditional use permits, CUPs.
A conditional use permit, or CUP, is different. It's for a type of use that the zoning rules actually mention as potentially okay in that zone, but only if it meets specific conditions. These are uses that might sit in, but they could also cause problems if they're not managed carefully.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about maybe a daycare center in a residential area or perhaps a small community hall. The zoning might say, yeah, these could be allowed, but you need a CUP. So the Planning Commission, or a similar body, reviews the proposal. They'll look at it closely. And the likely imposed conditions, things like specific operating hours, maybe parking requirements, landscaping buffers, traffic plans to make sure the use fits in and doesn't negatively impact the neighbors.
Okay, so a CUP is for something the zoning sort of expects might happen, but it needs extra scrutiny. While a variance is for something typically not allowed, driven by a property-specific problem.
That's a pretty good summary, yeah. Both provide flexibility, but they come about under different circumstances and get different levels of review.
Right. Okay, so we've got the local foundation.
Yep.
Zoning, variances, CUPs. Now, layering on top, especially here in California, we have significant environmental controls.
Oh, absolutely crucial. California's commitment to environmental protection adds a major layer of regulation that impacts land use, development, everything. And the big one, the one we see over and over in your sources, is CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act.
CEQA sounds like a major gatekeeper for any kind of development. What's its main job?
Well, CEQA, according to the CalRecycle source, is fundamentally about information. Its main purpose is to make sure public agencies, before they approve a project, really understand the potential significant environmental effects it might have. It forces them to identify ways to minimize those effects and, importantly, to consider feasible alternatives that could avoid or reduce the impacts. It's about bringing those potential environmental consequences right into the decision-making process and letting the public know about them, too.
So it forces agencies to stop and think about the environmental cost and then share that thinking.
Exactly. And the range of potential effects CEQA looks at is quite broad based on the sources. It's not just, endangered species or sensitive habitats, although those are definitely key concerns. If a project is in an environmentally sensitive location near protected land, a wetland, whatever, that definitely triggers extra scrutiny.
What are some of the maybe less obvious things CEQA digs into?
Oh, it gets into the nitty-gritty of how a project interacts with what's already there. They look at potential impacts from new sources of noise or air emissions. They consider transportation impacts, not just getting cars onto the site, but changes to traffic patterns, effects on roads beyond the entrance. Utilities and public services are a big one, too.
Utilities, you mean like water, power, sewer.
Exactly. The review checks if the property has adequate access to water, wastewater treatment, electricity, natural gas, trash disposal, stormwater drainage, or, if it's rural, making sure there's a proper well and septic system. And crucially, can the existing services actually handle the new demand from the project? That's a key question.
What about things like drainage, water quality?
Definitely. If a project changes how water drains off the site, they look at best management practices, BMPs, to prevent erosion and stop construction gunk from washing into streams or rivers. Aesthetics even get reviewed. Will the project create a lot of new light or glare? Will it significantly degrade the visual character of the area?
It even seems to look at the type of land itself, like if it's farmland.
Yes, the review checks if the site contains agricultural or forest land, sometimes referencing things like important farmland maps. And there's also a kind of catch-all for any unusual circumstances about the project or the site that could potentially lead to significant environmental effects.
That's a really thorough checklist. How do agencies actually document this whole review process?
There's a standard set of documents. It typically starts with an initial study. This is like a preliminary analysis done by the lead agency, that's the public agency, with the main responsibility for approving the project. They use this study to figure out if the project might have significant environmental effects, and they consult with other relevant agencies.
And what that study finds determines what happens next.
Right. If the initial study concludes there's no substantial evidence the project will have a significant environmental effect, the agency can prepare what's called a negative declaration, or ND. Now, if the study shows there might be significant effects, but the project gets modified, or mitigation measures are added that clearly avoid or reduce those impacts, to the point where there's no longer substantial evidence of a significant impact, then they can adopt a mitigated negative declaration, or MND.
And MND means they actually have to follow through on those fixes, right?
Critically important, yes. An MND requires a mitigation reporting or monitoring program that ensures those agreed-upon measures are actually put in place during construction and operation. It's not just promises.
What if the initial study finds the project may have a significant effect that can't just be mitigated away easily?
That's when you get the most involved document, the Environmental Impact Report, or EIR. An EIR is required when there's a real potential for significant environmental effects. It's a much deeper dive. It explores those significant effects, identifies ways to minimize them, and lays out alternatives to the project, including a no-project alternative. It's important to remember, like the sources point out, the EI itself is purely informational. It doesn't automatically stop a project, but it ensures decision makers and the public are fully informed about the potential consequences before giving the go-ahead. Sometimes if things change or there's an old EIR, they might do a supplement to a prior EIR, or even roll the review into a bigger plan, like a general plan EIR.
Okay, that makes sense. So ND, no significant effect. MND effects are mitigated. EIR. There might be significant effects. Here's the full picture.
That's the basic flow. And worth noting, there are also projects exempt from CEQA entirely. Some are exempt by state law, others fall under categorical exemptions, types of projects generally seen as not having significant effects. But remember, even categorical exemptions have exceptions. Like that location exception we mentioned, an otherwise exempt project in a really sensitive spot might still need a review.
And the public gets involved in this.
Oh yeah, very much so. Public review is required. Notices get published newspapers, posted on the site, mailed to neighbors. There's a formal review period, usually at least 30 days, where anyone can send in comments on the NED, MND, or draft EIR.
Where does the public find all this information? The studies, the reports?
It's usually available on the lead agency's website, at their offices, sometimes at the county clerk's office. And there's a statewide online database called CEQA. Public participation is definitely encouraged. Written comments, attending public meetings if they're held.
Okay, so after the agency reviews everything, gets public input, and makes a final decision on the project. What happens with the CEQA paperwork then?
Once the project is approved, assuming it went through CEQA review, the lead agency has to file a Notice of Determination, or NOD. Local agencies file it with the county clerk. If a state agency was involved, it also goes to the state clearinghouse. Filing that NOD is really important because it starts a 30-day clock. That's the statute of limitations for anyone to file a lawsuit challenging the CEQA compliance. If the agency forgets or fails to file the NOD, that statute of limitations jumps way up, usually to 180 days. So timely filing provides legal certainty.
Wow. It's fascinating how environmental concerns are just woven right into development potential in California. So, okay, we've built from the local zoning foundation, added that state environmental layer. What about the really fundamental powers the government holds over property, kind of regardless of specific rules?
Right. That brings us to what we call government rights powers governments have, inherently or constitutionally, that can impact private property. The two big ones to think about here are police power and eminent domain.
Police power. Okay, again, sounds like cops, but you mean something different here, right?
Entirely different context, yeah. In property law and land use, police power is the government's inherent authority to regulate private property and conduct without paying compensation when it's necessary to protect public health, safety, morals, or general welfare. Zoning itself is actually considered an exercise of police power. The sources don't explicitly define it that way, but they show tons of examples of it in action.
Like building codes.
Exactly. Building codes are a prime example, especially in California, requiring buildings to meet specific seismic safety standards like those in the California Building Code the Seismic Safety Commission works on. That's a direct use of police power to protect public safety from earthquake risks. Hazard mitigation planning is another big one.
Hazard mitigation.
Yeah. Sources like FEMA and Cal OES talk about this. It's about taking actions to reduce the loss of life and property by lessening disaster impacts. This includes building risk reduction strategies right into community plans, and tools like the Cal OES My Hazards website that helps you identify earthquake, flood, fire, tsunami risks for a specific address and suggests how to reduce those risks. That's public safety enabled by police power.
And mapping those risks is part of it, too.
Absolutely. FEMA creates those flood insurance rate maps, the firms defining flood zones. That directly impacts building rules, insurance rates. The California Geological Survey maps landslide risks, slope stability issues. These are all ways the government uses its power to identify risks, inform the public, and often regulate development in risky areas, all for public safety and welfare.
Okay, so police power is the government regulating property for the public good. Eminent domain feels different, more like the government taking property.
That's the other key government right, yeah. Eminent domain is the power of the government, or sometimes even a private entity given government authority to take private property for public use. But, and this is crucial, they have to pay the owner just compensation.
And this is allowed under the Constitution?
It is. It's right there in the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, the last part, often called the Takings Clause. It says, "Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation."
Why does the government even have this power? Seems like it clashes with private property rights.
Well, The idea, in theory, is to balance individual rights with the needs of the public as a whole. The rationale, which courts have reinforced, is that if a specific piece of property is truly needed for a public project, say a highway, a school, utility lines, it wouldn't be fair to make that one property owner bear the entire burden of giving up their property for everyone else's benefit. So eminent domain allows the taking for that public use, and the just compensation part is meant to ensure that individual doesn't suffer an unfair financial hit compared to the rest of the public benefiting from the project.
So it spreads the burden, compensates the individual. Makes sense. But what actually counts as public use? That sounds like it could be stretched.
Oh, that's definitely where the controversy often lies, as one of your sources points out. The definition has been debated and evolved in the courts. But everyone agrees the government can't just take property from person A simply to give it to person B for B's private benefit. There has to be a legitimate public purpose. Now, sometimes that purpose might involve transferring the land to a private developer as part of, say, an urban renewal plan. And that has been highly controversial over the years.
Right. And just compensation. What does that usually mean?
The Constitution just says just. The sources indicate this typically means, at minimum, the fair market value of the property. And importantly, it's the fair market value based on its highest and best use, ignoring the government's plan to take it. So if the government takes farmland for a highway, but that land's best use would have been commercial development next to the new interchange, the compensation should reflect that higher value, not just its value as farmland. Sometimes compensation might also factor in benefits if the taking actually increases the value of any remaining land the owner gets to keep.
What happens if an owner feels like the government's actions are a taking, maybe through regulations, but they haven't formally used eminent domain?
That can lead to what's called inverse condemnation. In that case, the property owner initiates a lawsuit against the government. They argue that a regulation or some government action has restricted their property use so severely that it amounts to a taking, even without the formal process, and they demand compensation.
Can the government take property just temporarily?
Yes, temporary takings are possible. That's when the government needs to use a property for a limited time, maybe like an easement to stage equipment during road construction nearby. Compensation, then, is usually based on the rental value of the property for that specific period.
It's interesting to think about the research side of this, too, like that study you mentioned about compensation payouts in New York City.
Absolutely. Research like that empirical study helps us understand how these big constitutional ideas actually play out on the ground. How is fair market value actually negotiated? How are settlements reached? What factors really influence the final compensation owners receive?
Yeah, okay, this is definitely a complex tapestry. We've got local zoning rules, state environmental laws like CEQA, and these big foundational government rights, police power, and eminent domain. How does a real estate agent, especially in California, actually weave all these threads together in their day-to-day work?
Right, this is where it all comes together, where the rubber meets the road for you. As an agent, you're not just selling bricks and mortar or a piece of dirt. You're helping someone acquire a whole bundle of rights and responsibilities that constantly interact with this complex regulatory world. Understanding this landscape gives you, frankly, incredible power to advise your clients well.
How so?
Well, think about it. A property's value isn't just comps. It's fundamentally limited or maybe enhanced by its zoning. Is it zoned for what your client actually wants to do there? Could they potentially get a variance or a CUP if they needed one? Knowing the zoning is step one to understanding potential. Then, if development or major changes are planned, you need to be thinking about the CEQA process.
Anticipate CEQA. How would an agent even do that?
By recognizing those triggers we talked about. Is the property in a sensitive area? Is the project big enough to potentially impact traffic, utilities, air quality? Now, you're not doing the environmental review yourself, obviously, but knowing when CEQ review is likely, understanding the different outcomes, ND, MND, EIR, and knowing that public review adds time, that's crucial for setting realistic expectations for your clients about timelines and potential hurdles. And understanding police power isn't just academic theory, it translates directly. Building codes impact renovation costs, feasibility, those hazard maps, FEMA flood maps, Cal OES My Hazards for fire or seismic risk, landslide maps, those are critical for assessing a property's safety, its future resilience. This stuff directly impacts insurance costs, lender decisions, the property's long-term value, its usability. And general plans, like that Contra Costa example, set the big picture for community growth infrastructure plans, open space rules which can hint at future zoning changes or assessments. Subdivision rules then dictate how you carve up land. It's all connected.
And even something less common like eminent domain.
Yeah, while it's less frequent day to day, it's still a risk to be aware of, especially if you're dealing with properties near where major public projects are planned or even just being talked about. Knowing how to check for proposed public works or just understanding the basics of just compensation could be vital if a client's property might be in the path.
So it's really about seeing beyond just the physical building or the land and understanding the whole legal and regulatory framework wrapped around it.
Exactly that. It's providing that deeper level of insight. By understanding these layers, the zoning, the environmental review, the government rights, you can more accurately assess not just what a property is, but what it can or maybe cannot be. You can spot potential hurdles early, advise clients on the right due diligence, and help them make smarter, more informed decisions. It really empowers you to navigate these complexities and be that trusted, that restorative guide for them.
It definitely highlights that real estate is way more than just location, location, location. It's also regulation, regulation,
It
regulation.
really shapes everything. Yeah.
Okay, let's try and pull this all together then. We've unpacked this idea that seemingly simple property decisions are governed by this complex blueprint of land use controls. We started with that local foundation, zoning, which dictates what you can do and how you can build, and looked at how variances and conditional use permits offer some structured flexibility.
Right. Then we layered on California's really significant environmental regulations, focusing mostly on CEQA, how it mandates review of potential impacts across a really wide spectrum of concerns, from habitats to utilities, and requires public disclosure through things like NDs, MNDs, and EIRs.
And finally, we looked at those fundamental government rights that kind of sit underneath everything. Police power, the government's ability to regulate for health and safety, seen in building codes, hazard mapping, and eminent domain. That power to take private property for public use, but with just compensation.
These are the forces, yeah. Often unseen at first glance, but they profoundly shape the world we build around us.
Which leaves us with this thought to maybe carry forward. As you operate out there in the real estate world, how does this constant, dynamic tension between an individual's right to control their property and the government's need to regulate for the collective good using these mechanisms we've discussed, how does it ultimately define the shape and character of the communities and neighborhoods we all share? And maybe more practically, how can your deep understanding of this complex master blueprint not just boost your professional expertise, but truly empower you and your clients to contribute positively, knowledgeably to the places where we all live and work?